China Global Television Network.
On today's World Insight.
2019年，我们用汗水浇灌收获。
Chinese President Xi Jinping's New Year's address. How will China ring in the new year?
新年快乐！
And China's foreign investment law enters into force. Can the highly anticipated law invigorate the economy? And here is our host, Yan Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live on CGTN. We begin today's show with Chinese President Xi Jinping's New Year's Eve address. In his speech, he gave a brief summary of the past year and pointed out what to expect next. Looking forward, a Phase 1 trade deal between China and the U.S. is closing in, and the year 2020 has long been a landmark in China's roadmap to hit targets, including complete poverty elimination. Before our discussion, let's take a look at this.
President Xi had sent New Year's greetings to the Chinese people.
2019年，我们用汗水浇灌收获，以实干笃定前行，高质量发展平稳推进。我国国内生产总值预计将接近100万亿元人民币，人均将迈上1万美元的台阶。三大攻坚战取得关键进展。
President Xi reviewed major development strategies the country has been promoting during the past 12 months, including the Guangdong, Hong Kong, Macau Greater Bay Area, the country's robust campaign of poverty elimination and scientific research programs such as Lunar Probe Chang'e 4 and Long March 5 Y3 rocket. President Xi also talked about the major events that China witnessed and the significant achievements it made over the past 12 months, such as the Import Expo, the Grand Military Parade, and the celebration of the 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. The Chinese president also shared his outlook for the new year.
2020年是具有里程碑意义的一年。 我们将全面建成小康社会，实现第一个100年奋斗目标。2020年也是脱贫攻坚、决战决胜之年。
President Xi said the successful practice of the one country, two systems policy in Macau shows that the policy is fully applicable. He also said that his heart is with the people of Hong Kong. Finally, he encouraged the Chinese people to work hard and fight for their future.
祝大家新年快乐！
For more on Chinese President Xi Jinping's New Year address, we are joined in our Beijing studio, Fu Jun, professor from the National School of Development at Peking University. Meanwhile, in our Beijing studio, Liu Baocheng from the University of International Business and Economics. Joining us in Washington, D.C., we have Paulo von Schirach, president of the Global Policy Institute, the Public Policy Research Institute, that is. Welcome to all of you. Happy New Year to every one of you, gentlemen.
Happy New Year.
I want to start by asking the important question, that is, when China is looking at its achievements over the past 1 year, Mr. Schirach, what do you make of where China is and how China has been working with the others over the past year, given the challenges of the new year, Mr. Schirach?
Well, look, the challenges are significant. It's no mystery to anybody that the bilateral U.S.-China relationship, which arguably is the most important bilateral relationship in the world. These are the two largest economies on earth, and the relationship has been quite troubled. It's very difficult to predict at this point what the new year will bring. It seems that there is some possibility, or in fact quite sure, that there will be some agreement, some kind of a deal on the complicated trade issues which have troubled the relationship for more than a year. If we can go beyond this hurdle, and if there is some kind of an understanding between Beijing and Washington on how to carry the relationship, well, I would think that this will help both Washington, quite frankly, and Beijing, as China is engaged in so many other, mostly domestic items on its own agenda.
Well, Mr. von Schirach, Professor Fu, has been emphasizing from the U.S. perspective, bilateral relations is significance for China. What do you make of the significance of this speech in terms of trying to raise the momentum, trying to bring the country with high morale, obviously with this New Year address by the Chinese president, Professor Fu?
Well, what struck me most is he talked about the heaven, the earth. The heaven, he talked about a heck accomplishment. It's the landing of Chang'e on the other side of the moon. So this, to me, is a deep reflection of what Chinese have achieved in the past in terms of technology. But having mentioned that, he did not mention the little man in the street. He talked about the poverty reduction efforts and the people who have been doing those work and work very hard. And he also talked about the forest firefighters to save lives, and they themselves have sacrificed their lives. So it's not just the global issue, but also the domestic issue. Of course, that has deep implications for the global picture as well.
Professor Liu, tell me more about that, because you've been doing research about the Chinese economy, how important it is at the end of the year for the Chinese president to bring the morale high and also try to bring the momentum developing into the next year.
Well, President Xi's address is being regularized to inject confidence during the turn of the year. And this turn is utterly important because, number one, the Chinese government wanted to deliver the promise to double Chinese per capita income over the past 1 decade. And two is that we want to completely eradicate the poverty. And then
Chinese standard, of course.
Yeah, by Chinese standard, and also to really fully engage in developing the new emerging industries that we, with the technological advancement, and also that to deal with big nation relationship like with the United States, with Russia, and etc., has really paved the right ground for Chinese economic growth and for Chinese global space for economic expansion.
Yeah. Meanwhile, internationally, we have seen that the Chinese president, together with the Russian president, have been exchanging their greetings with one another for the new year. Of course, this time is very much focused on China and Russia. Obviously, there's also has a lot to do with all the changes that is going on in the world recently, Professor Fu.
Well, the two economies tend to be very complementary, so it's very important for the two countries to work together. Well, for the Chinese economy to continue to move forward, we need to have a lot of energy. Energy consumption will be very high, and much of that will have to be imported from the overseas. And Russia, in a way, is in the position to supply that part. Yeah. So it's very important for the two countries.
If you look at the year 2020, Mr. von Schirach, for any country probably there's a huge uncertainty there. There is an uncertainty, that's probably the key word for our world these days, unfortunately. So when China is trying to bring itself together to face up to the challenges of next year, whether there's likely to be equivalent efforts from the other countries, Washington included, it's another question. Now, we know that your country is likely to develop into the election season. Do you think it's more going to be about the elections, or is it more about geopolitics? Or is it more about sharpening some of the strength in certain areas, technology included?
Well, look, very good question and a very complicated one. As you correctly indicated, the United States, will start its presidential and congressional election cycle very, very soon. The Iowa caucuses, which signal the very beginning of the Democratic Party process to eventually designate a nominee, will be about a month and change from now. So the domestic issues will be very, very prevalent in the American political debate. And of course, we all know there's even this pending issue of the attempt to impeach President Trump, which is not, a regular course of business. This is highly unusual. It has happened only 3 times in the history of the United States. So that's another complication which creates a lot of static here in Washington and across the nation. The United States, to try to manage everything correctly, in other words, to go through the election process, to complete in one fashion or another the impeachment, which will have to go to the Senate very soon, and at the same time manage global relations is a huge challenge. I don't expect the United States to be able to deploy, the full strength of its capabilities and hopefully wisdom in its global footprint.
Yeah.
But again, the bilateral relationship with China will be on top of the agenda.
I see. Professor Liu, when the U.S. is coming into an election season, according to tradition, it probably means the rest of the world have to wait until they fight out who is likely to be what and which party is going to play what role. And eventually the policies could fall into places. Now, things have been changing though. And there seems to be quicker decisions countries and economies have to make now because we're at a crossroad. WTO is a great example of that. So Professor Liu, how do you think with China, with a New Year speech with full confidence like this, likely to deal with the issue of patience toward Washington and also the issue of uncertainty from Washington?
We always say that if you're really healthy enough, you're not really afraid of many viruses attack. So I mean,
is that the analogy you would like to use?
Right. To address uncertainty, 2 keywords. One is really stability. The other is agility. So if we keep our economic growth stable, if we keep our institutional and political structure stable enough, and people have confidence and people have the right impetus to move forward with the right direction, so we're not really afraid of uncertainty. And the other is agility.
Okay.
To be adapt to really new changes, to be able
Flexible.
to adjust yourself into new situations, new challenges. I think that's also utterly important because you mentioned, the looming word of uncertainty.
Yeah, I mean, spirit when it's high, it certainly helps, but the policies have to be right. And it has to be also the right timetable. All of this, when put together, probably would mean a success in implementation rather. Professor Fu, you are a researcher in governance. You look at both global governance and political governance in China. So what's your reading of all of these factors at this moment?
Well, in terms of global governance, you really see a very massive shift of economic centers globally from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And I haven't seen a sort of corresponding shift to smooth that process. And that is part of the source of tensions between China and the United States. Now, as a reflection of the slow move of those reforms, China also need to look at its own economy. We have been doing well in terms of market-oriented reforms and opening up to the rest of the world, such that we have achieved now by the end of last year $10,000 from a little of $150. This is a heck of accomplishment for us to continue. So we need to keep the momentum of doing that, which I mean specifically is we need to look at our state-owned enterprises very seriously, to reform those very seriously. If you compare the state sector with the non-state sector, the non-state sector has been contributing 60%. But receiving 20% of bank loans. So there is room, as you can imagine, to continue to improve that so that our economy become more efficient, more resilient.
But you know, there are other button issues. For example, about Taiwan, early election, local election in January. There's also the Hong Kong issue, which is likely to have a spillover effect into the year 2020 as well. You also have issues like Xinjiang, Tibet, which others have been using as tools to manipulate as China thinks the situation here in China domestically. So, Professor Liu, how will, you know, on the one hand, development, the issue, economic development and globalization development. On the other hand, some of the important issues that China has to deal with all the time in order to make sure it's on the right path. How to juggle it with all of these efforts at the same time, Professor?
Well, during the most recent central government meeting, a key word also is really reminding that the governance and the capability of governance. So China, given its vast territory, given its big number of population, so how we can really streamline the institutional reforms through the right type of governance and how to elevate the capacity of many of those local government officials, I think that's the key. And that has to do with all the issues that you have really touched upon. So right now, you know, how we can really communicate with this world is also a challenge because China has been doing the right work, but communication becomes a key in a globalized world. So we have to really acquire this type of skills, like what you have been doing, is really to communicate the right message and also to be decoded in the intended way by the global community.
One of the things is to let people to know about the realities in
exactly.
China. You know, whether it is really glory or it is more down to earth, doesn't matter. But people really need to know what is really going on here in China rather than heard it through non-fact descriptions.
That's right.
Mr. von Schirach, that's the question I really want to go to you for. Because next year, when we talk about uncertainty, a lot have to do with the lack of communication, lack of real understanding, which is contributing to the uncertainty on top of everything. So, Mr. von Schirach, do you think there is likely the patience, for example, from Washington and others, be able to reach out and listen to what China is really about? Do you think, what kind of expectation do you also have for China and Beijing to do the same?
Well, look, this is extremely important. You know, again, I keep repeating myself. The level, the dimensions of the bilateral relationship on trade and business and investments and what have you between the United States and China is unparalleled elsewhere in the world. So it is extremely important that the two sides communicate and communicate effectively. There is a lot of static right now. And I will, you know, and I'm sure you know very well that here in Washington there are all sorts of theories and I don't know, dark conspiracies, if you wish, even to think about what China is up to. The Chinese are doing this, the Chinese are doing that. There has to be a way to clear the air. Maybe this first step, this trade deal that will hopefully at least stabilize the relationship, even though it will not address all the outstanding issues, can be a solid, good point to start fresh, if you wish, in 2020.
I see.
However, much more needs to be done because there is a lot of confusion and a lot of misunderstanding. I mean, the perception here is, oh, China doesn't play by the rules. Oh, China wants to do its own technology standards that are different from those that everybody else will use. China is up to this, China is up to do that. And much of that is just, you know, talk. and not based on fact, as you indicated. But it's really important that for the Chinese government, of course, and society to be able to effectively communicate what's going on and the actual real opportunities and reforms that have taken place in China, so to welcome foreign direct investment, to treat foreign investors, on an equal footing as compared to Chinese players, etc., etc. All these things, which one would think are sort of already understood, need to be somehow re-explained.
Yes, we will, of course, deal with those issues as the year goes on. In fact, later in our program, we're going to talk about the foreign investment law, which put into effect on the first day of this year. Before we go, I want to have the three of you, maybe you have one phrase or two to describe what should be like for 2020. Professor Liu?
Well, to further strive for a bigger prospect, but still domestic stability and external agility.
I see. Mr. von Schirach?
Engagement. I'm repeating myself, but I say engagement is really important, but it has to be at multiple levels.
I see.
Governments and society.
Professor Fu?
Work hard towards peace so that you also have a prosperity.
Okay. Fu Jun, Paulo von Schirach, and Liu Baocheng, thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. China's foreign investment law enters into force. Can the highly anticipated law invigorate the economy? We're going to ask the next question right after this break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Now we turn to China's foreign investment law, which was approved in the year 2019 and enters into force on January the 1st, 2020. The new law follows China's direction of further opening up and economic reform. The foreign investment law is designed to give foreign businesses broader market access, protect their intellectual property, prohibit forced technology transfer, and also guarantee equal treatment for foreign and domestic companies. Years in the making, China's foreign investment law exemplifies the government's commitment to facilitate foreign companies doing business in China and enhance the kinds of market competition that benefits Chinese consumers. China's Supreme People's Court, or SPC, last Friday issued a judicial interpretation applicable to the foreign investment law, aiming to better protect the legitimate rights and interests of foreign investors in the country.
Step inside any leading automobile, textile, or other large company in China, and you are likely to find an automation platform made by German company Lens. Entering China in 1997, they say they are very concerned about the stability, fairness, and openness of policies.
As foreign investors, we want to make sure there are laws and regulations for foreign companies to follow and to protect their rights on a legal basis.
The foreign investment law takes effect on January 1st. It addresses some of the core concerns of foreign companies operating in China, including complaints about forced technology transfers and lack of intellectual property protection. As a key supplier of drive and automation solutions, Lens relocated its Asian Research and Development Center to Shanghai in 2019.
IP protection is one of the biggest worries among foreign firms in China. They are afraid that their technologies may be stolen or copied. The new law will protect it on a legal level. It is very detailed and comprehensive. I think it will reduce foreign firms' worries to some degree and boost their confidence and hopes for doing business here.
The new law places great emphasis on equal national treatment of foreign investment, putting foreign investors on a more level playing field with domestic investors and giving them equal protection.
Also on the market access barrier, we have seen in the past year that the China authorities, they try to lower it, and a big job was done. But on the other hand, there are many indirect barriers when companies arrive doing business on the territory. We hope that it will help to boost the equal treatment between Chinese and European companies.
Foreign investors say ensuring the consistency of the new law's enforcement on different levels is as important as passing the law itself.
For more on the foreign investment law, we are joined in Washington by Bruce Fain, former Associate Deputy Attorney General and General Counsel of the Federal Communications Commission under President Reagan. In Hong Kong, we are joined by Edward Xie, who is the Chairman and CEO of Gaofeng Advisory Company. In our Beijing studio, Liu Baocheng is still with us, the Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics from University of International Business and Economics. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Big deal, I guess, Professor Liu, this new law.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, that people often attribute to Chinese, attractiveness for global investment in terms of the cheaper labor and the concessions of the land, government attitude, etc. I think the key is really the Chinese legal construction that is really there to pave the right way and bring transparency and predictability.
It sounds so abstract to me,
Yes.
Professor. So what's new about this law that's likely to really make the foreign investors more engaging with China?
Well, more specifically, one is that the guaranteed of equal level playing field with all type of Chinese entities, be it SOEs or the private firms.
Okay, that's
the
one.
other is really the pre-establishment national treatment, so that they can register company as any other Chinese company do.
All right.
And then also negative list, which is really the key for them to identify where are those areas they can step in, and also facilitation of the establishment, and also the right type of protection for their properties,
Quite a long
be it
list.
tangible and intangible.
Quite a long list,
Yes.
Mr. Fain. It seems that the foreign investors could be quite happy about all of these new fascinating possibilities.
Well, on the face, I wouldn't have any quarrel. But implementation is still a question mark. The issue is whether or not these requirements against any expropriation, the requirements of equal treatment of foreign investors with the domestic entities, with a fair and even-handed administration of the laws, will be executed.
Mr. Xie, would you like to respond to that? What's your take?
Yeah, my take is that this is a process that the Chinese government has been undertaking since they started the reform and opening 40 years ago. Over the last several decades, China actually has been opening up its markets gradually, sector by sector. It's not perfect, but it's a very consistent direction. I think what we're now seeing is actually a further step forward in that direction, that China has recognized that reform and opening is the only way for China to continue to become better, to become stronger, and to embrace foreign companies into the China market is a very important step.
Professor Liu?
Yeah, let me respond to the question by some specifics as I observe. This law was made in March of last year, and during the legislation process, multi-stakeholder engagement took place for a number of rounds, so that all foreign companies, be it law firms, be it local governments, have full opportunity to reflect their opinion. And this is really unusual as compared to other legislation. And the other is MOFCOM has conducted thorough training to local government officials and even business leaders and Chamber of Commerce, etc., during the past 9 months. And more importantly, I think the most recently on 26, Chinese State Council published the implementation procedures to as how to implement this law in a very effective way. And in addition, that the Chinese Judicial Department has also provided a judicial review and further interpretation as some type of case law that can really address such an issue. So I think this is very serious, and we need to have confidence in this law for its implementation.
Yeah, Mr. Fain, I don't know whether you know the Chinese system very well, but obviously what Professor Liu to me is trying to say, it seems to him that there has been a process about local about specific government departments dealing with trade and economics and cooperation, and also at the State Council, which is the national level, the national government, and at the same time the judicial branch of Chinese government have been dealing with this issue since the proposal was put into effect earlier. So Mr. Fain, probably that could answer some of your questions. On the other hand, Mr. Fain, may I ask you about the fact that the environment for trade is not very pleasant these days. We have a war, quote unquote, trade war going on between China and the United States, which has been protracted into the year 2020. Meanwhile, we also see some so-called, what many believe as protectionist measures coming from the U.S. toward the other economies, in China, to China particularly, about Chinese tech firms and others. Do you think one party's actions is likely to poison the overall environment of improvement on both sides? Mr. Fain.
But I don't think the responses are just unilateral here. The United States was responding, maybe in an ill-advised way, to what was thought to be a Chinese unfairness in having a much closed market there and subsidizing state-owned enterprises that were entering the United States market. China is notorious not for protecting intellectual property as it is in the West.
I could understand why people are concerned about whether or not this law could be appropriately implemented. But my understanding, having worked and still working with quite a large number of American companies operating in China, as well as my understanding on the intentions of the Chinese government. First of all, I think the Chinese government is really very earnest in its desire to continue to open up, because they have seen the dividend of the reform and opening up since the 40 years ago.
Yeah.
And China has been a major beneficiary of globalization and multilateralism. And therefore, as you know, in the last year or so, as President Trump was drumming up the U.S.-China trade war, the Chinese side has actually been reinforcing or underscoring the importance of maintaining globalization, maintaining multilateralization, and the opposition against utilization. This move by the Chinese government to continue to open up and to allow more degrees of freedom for foreign companies, including American companies to operate in the China market, is earnest. And I think this is really the opportunity for many American companies to truly tap into the incredible potential of the China market. This is now the opportunity, and the law is going to be helping it.
Yeah, Mr. Xie, if I could follow up, earlier Mr. Fain certainly had been put into question what he considers as important, which is the IPR protection. And he, if I could use a quote of him, is China is, quote, not well known for protecting of international property, end of quote. Now, of course, there's a lot of whether known or facts known. Those are very different things, as we know, in a very much a world of social media and direct different opinions. So, Mr. Xie, what do you make of that, and what does this piece of legislation also mean for China's commitment and China's urging its own companies and departments to be committed to intellectual property protection?
Well, certainly, as China evolved from a planned economy 40 years ago, the whole context of legislation, policy, rule of law, and so on was so drastically different than the rest of the world, in particular the countries that are of capitalism, and is their own sort of rule of law and so on. Over time, China was trying to evolve, and of course, along the way, things are not perfect. There are a lot of imperfections along the way. But along the way, the Chinese government, in particular central government I'm talking about, is trying to really improve on the situation. Times have changed. Nobody should look at what happened 40 years ago or even 20 years ago and say this is now still the case as of today. Because the evolution of China is towards a more knowledge-based society, which is being raised based on more innovation and disruptions in business. Many of these disruption and innovations are governed or driven by Chinese companies themselves. And the leading Chinese companies would need to have the IPR protection as much as any other companies from any other countries. And therefore, one would expect that the protection, the IPR protection environment in China will have to improve over time.
So, Professor Liu, I want to come back to you about that point. Mr. Fei made a great point, which is, what about other factors besides the economic and trade issues that's going to have an overall impact on the decision being made? Even after this new law put into effect, even with implementations, if one side is doing something that the other side take as unfriendly or unlawful, will things spiral out of control, even with this, what China consider as a great law?
Well, despite of the uncertainty or unpredictability on the U.S. side, I do see that there is a certain limit that they can really push the envelope to. And
what do you mean by they?
Yeah,
who are you referring to?
I mean, because the global economy, particularly for the biggest economies, they are so much intertwined, and now, after almost 2 years of the disputes and also the punishment on both sides, I think now there is a time for people to return to rationality, and hawkish people has been trying with number of efforts to really link many other issues with the trade and economic relations. I think now the White House has been trying to refrain from the vicious or the toxic the containment over such sort of issues. So that is why we are able to achieve the Phase 1 deal, and hopefully through the successful implementation, and we are going to engage more and restore the confidence between the two
economies. As you may know, Mr. Liu, may I just, Washington is much more complicated than just one White House. There are different branches of the U.S. government. There's also different momentum developing there among different interest groups in the U.S. Regarding their relationship with China. So, Professor Liu, can this law be beautifully implemented free from all of these uncertainties, Professor Liu? Unfortunately, I have to use that word again.
Yeah, I do not think one single law can solve all the problem and address all the complaints. Things can really pop up. So, but the as the professor of legal training, I do see that this is really a high level of seriousness.
Mr. Xie, Professor Liu, what do you think if you were providing advice to the American companies or other global companies, looking at this piece of legislation, looking at that, they say, great, it's wonderful. But on the other hand, what about the uncertainties? What is that fine balance? Mr. Liu.
I think one is really to the Chinese government and Chinese lawmakers, is that just because there are hawkish groups in the U.S. side, and that also there are populist groups within China, to wait for a negative response to such a law. So Chinese government and lawmakers should be very firm to really implement this law. Otherwise, it's going to serve their agenda. That can be very toxic. And also to the U.S. community, I think, look at the fact that, how many Chinese, the companies have been working with U.S. firms within China and globally on a very successful basis. And look at the fact that China is the second largest recipient of global FDI. None of those decision makers behind those, foreign investment into China are really unwise enough to make stumbles. So therefore, look at the broad picture and work with Chinese community, work with the Chinese government to continually improve its investment and trade environment, and that's the right type of approach.
Right. Mr. Xie, final words also from you.
Yeah, in order to be successful in the China market, American companies need to make themselves a real insider in the business and political community in China. That means that the American companies have to work closer with the key stakeholders within the Chinese business and political circles, working closer with the government at the central level, at the local level, as well as their local Chinese partners, business partners as well, The American companies need to do a much better job in this dimension.
Mr. Fain.
So I do think that as we speak today, the environment is not overwhelmingly constructive to lower the barriers. For example, with all the law that you've described with new foreign investment, the President of the United States under U.S. law could bar any American company from investing in China under the International Economic Emergencies Powers Act.
Yeah.
And he's done that in some respects with regard to Huawei, where you can't sell them certain technologies or things of that sort. So the law could be nullified overnight by the stroke of a pen, which means that the diplomatic relations are going to be highly important to see how effective this law will be in act.
Edward Xie, Liu Baocheng, Bruce Fain. Gentlemen, thank you so much. Happy New Year to all of you. Thank you. Really appreciate it. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for more insights across China and around the world. And Happy New Year to you, every one of you. Thank you.